I'm actually quite concerned about the way in which this is being approached. We should be working in partnership with China, not being subject to coercion and control by the Chinese. And that does raise questions as to our relationship. And as you know, I have for some time been pressing for a broader inquiry into our relationship with China. We need to have a mature discussion about where we go from here.
Do you think it helps when you have someone with the status of Andrew Twiggy Forrest, Australian billionaire, saying that we should be holding back on this inquiry until after the US election so it's not politicised, and then saying that China shouldn't be the focus of it?
Well, look, I think that the inquiry does not need to start immediately. We are still trying to deal with a pandemic globally. We are not over the worst of it yet. In Australia here, we are doing well, but that is not necessarily the case globally. We need to pause and eventually go in and have a look at how the world dealt with the pandemic. Obviously, that will have some focus on China, but not just China. We know that this virus spread in a number of countries unbeknownst to the various governments, and that had consequences on other nations. So I share his view that we need to broaden the scope of the proposed inquiry, international inquiry, to look at how the world handled the pandemic.
But surely postponing it until after November at least is quite a significant delay when we don't know what's going to be the thing that takes us out of this virus pandemic. It could be going on for quite some time and we could be missing out on key information that would help fasten that process.
Sure, and I think there does need to be a balance there. November is probably probably too late, but we don't need to necessarily start this immediately. We do need to focus on the problem as it exists right now, and that is we are dealing with an ongoing pandemic.
And is that an acceptable marker, though, do you think, to be pinning it off what's happening in US politics? Isn't this something that should be bipartisan enough that we can get going on it before then?
Look, I don't think it's helpful to introduce markers like elections because that in itself creates a political tone to the discussion. We need to be mature about this. I think we need to have an inquiry into the pandemic, but I also think Australia needs to have a look at more broadly our relationship with China, and I will for a sixth time try and have the Parliament stand up an inquiry to look at that relationship, which would include matters such as health, in addition to other areas of past concern, things like political interference, but also looking at our trade relationships, looking at how we are very dependent on China, and that's been brought out in this particular crisis in terms of supply chains. We do need to examine our relationship with China.
And when it comes to the state of the economy, we heard some pretty damning evidence in the Senate committee yesterday from the head of Treasury saying that there are going to be plenty of businesses that do not survive this pandemic response. Do you think that there is more the federal government could be doing to keep businesses going through this?
Oh, look, absolutely. And the government is working through a whole range of measures. I myself have written to the Finance Minister suggesting that he invoke Clause 4.7 of the Commonwealth Procurement Rules, which requires officials to give weighting to the economic benefit of any government procurement. I was actually quite disgusted by the government in their handing of the COVIDSafe data cloud storage contract to a US company when we have the expertise in this country, we have the capability in this country, and we want to be investing and supporting those sorts of capabilities in Australia. In my view, a disgusting move by the government, a disgraceful move by the government.
Is that enough that you've decided not to download the app?
Oh, look, I have concerns in relation to the application, which are likely to be addressed by legislation that will come before the Parliament between the 12th and the 14th of May. The fact that the government gave this contract to a US company is not a factor that I'm considering in relation to downloading application. I just point out that now is a time, we understand that we need to rebuild the economy. We understand that we need to relook at things like self-reliance. We really do need to focus on making sure that when we expend taxpayers' money, that we direct it where possible at Australian companies, where we consider the economic impact, the number of jobs created, the capital investment that might occur here, and indeed how that affects supply chains. That must change. The government's thinking on this must change so that we have greater emphasis on rebuilding the Australian economy and making sure there is self-reliance within the economy.
So, sorry, just to clarify though, does that mean you won't be downloading the COVIDSafe app, the tracing app, until after the legislation's passed?
Look, I have some concerns about the legislation or the determination made by the minister. Of course, he made that determination, I think it was on Saturday. He can change that determination just as easily today or tomorrow or the next day. Once it's in legislation, it will require the Parliament to make changes to that legislation. There are also questions about whether or not the determination would override some other Commonwealth legislation, such as the Crimes Act and the warrant powers in the Crimes Act. So for me, and it's a personal decision, I'm not saying that someone who wakes up in the morning, drives a bus all day, comes home, watches Netflix, goes to a sporting event, would not download the application. But someone like me, like journalists who deal with whistleblowers all of the time, we just need to be super careful to make sure that we have legal backing to resist any attempts to get access to data that might show who we have been in contact with.